Hey, what's going on, everybody? I want to welcome you back to this podcast with Jorge Quintero. So we started off on his story and how he got to this point, but this episode we're going to more interact on what we do as practitioners. He has his own style. I have my own style. So obviously you see my page, you know what I do. We learn more how he approaches it. We have some similarities, of course, but it definitely has some unique aspects that he brings too. We'll kind of interject on both. So with that being said, how do we actually get it done in the NeuroJorge? I know we're right inside the other side. We're going to do some stuff later, but what do you do to get down to show these people how to get their mind right, as I always say?
Right. So the first thing that I want to say about the NeuroGym is that I'm not promoting a cure to mental health disorders. I think the NeuroGym should be in everyone's toolbox if you do struggle with mental health. I think a comprehensive approach is best. But that being said, my approach to mental health is first, we got to identify what are the mental issues or symptoms that you're really struggling with. Is it anxiety? Is it fear? Is it being too distracted and impulsive? Is it the fact that you can't make good decisions and you can't focus? Depending on what it is, will actually dictate what kind of training we incorporate with exercise. So by default, everyone will have an exercise program, whether that involves cardio or more strength training or mobility will really depend on the person's like severity of symptoms as well as their baseline level of fitness. But after that, we we incorporate different elements at different parts of the program. So let's take an example of a person that suffers from anxiety. A person that suffers from chronic anxiety or chronic stress is going to have certain brain regions that become overactive and other brain regions that become underactive. So, for example, we know that in people that are chronically stressed, their prefrontal cortex shuts down. Their amygdala actually grows in volume and becomes very hypersensitive. The hippocampus, which is their ability to actually form memories and to change, decreases. So, for a person that has chronic anxiety and chronic stress, from a neurogen perspective, we've got to get those brain regions back into balance. And I like to compare it to physical imbalances. You know, people can present with upper cross syndrome, lower cross syndrome. They can have lower back pain because they've got really tight hamstrings. It's the same concept with the mind. You can create chronic imbalances over time that are maladaptive. And I like to consider mental health disorders not necessarily a bad thing, but at least for the context of the world we live in right now, it is maladaptive. Like it doesn't help us live on a day-to-day basis. Um, so for these clients, I would focus on increasing activation of the prefrontal cortex. So getting people to logically reason, to think, to essentially regulate the fear or the emotional responses from the amygdala. Two, I would prescribe them some form of exercise that has been shown to increase the volume of the hippocampus because the hippocampus is also involved in stress regulation. So having a bigger hippocampus will give this person a better ability to manage stress. And by adding in exercise, we actually increase certain hormones in the brain and the body that promote brain change. So we actually push the brain in the direction that we want it to. When we actually contract our muscles and we move, there's a couple of chemicals that start circulating in your blood. Like the most popular one is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which is actually one of the best ways to grow the hippocampus in size. And it's also a molecule that promotes neuroplasticity or brain change. We know for neurodegenerative conditions, for example, that exercise also releases something called irisin, which is a neuroprotective molecule for people that may be susceptible to Alzheimer's disease. So through exercise, we're basically getting a chemical release of things that promotes neuroplasticity. And then we couple that with the actual targeted exercises that affect specific mental muscles or brain regions to either bring them online or to reduce their activity.
Are you familiar with the nun study? It was a group of nuns, I forget where, in the mid 80s, and they all donated their brains to science. And there was one particular nun named Sister Bernadette who her brain had all the signs of Alzheimer's, was riddled with plaques and tangles, but yet she showed no symptoms up until the day she died of Alzheimer's. So the researchers were curious of what was her life like. And one of the biggest things the other nuns that knew her would say, she was known to ride her bike around up until when she died at, I think, 86 years old. So she lived pretty long. She would do crossword puzzles. So essentially, when I learned about this about a little over a decade ago, and you probably know this book because if you know about BDNF, you might have heard it. I at least heard it first from a guy who wrote a book called Spark, John Rady. And have you read that book before?
I haven't.
Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
I'm sure you know John Rady or familiar of him. So he talked about that in his book Spark and how Sister Bernadette had all these signs of Alzheimer's, but yet her symptoms didn't show. And one of the key takeaways he saw was she was very physically active, so exercise, and then she did stuff that stimulated the brain. And that's kind of what led me with Mind Body One of, okay, exercise will be involved to a degree. So that's where I kind of think we kind of differ. So I have a kind of separate component of business where we have a strength conditioning or fitness part of it, but then also have drills that involve movement. But I come more from the mental skills and cognitive approach, but it still comes to the same middle ground. Are we getting you to think, reshape how you think about things? Because, you know, like CBT is one of the most popular therapy approaches. So I kind of derived that from when I was a clinician in psychology to be like, okay, let's take some parts of CBT, but apply it to these dynamic drills. And we talked about this a little bit when we were going to eat about how you got to recalibrate in real time. It's almost like neurofeedback, but not getting that direct computer image of what's going on. But you know, you have to look at, oh, this is the wrong Stroop word or color, or this is not the right cue. And you got to refocus. And that's kind of where my premise goes with that. So so the BDNF stuff, I think a lot of people don't know about that and how beneficial it is to exercise just to get that response, let alone all the thinking components of what you do. So
Right. And I want to say that exercise is one of the best known ways to increase neuroplasticity of the brain. You know, a lot of pop science or pop neuroscience talks about neuroplasticity in this context of like you pay attention to things that you want to change and then you repeat certain actions over and over. But no one has said, okay, how can I speed up this process? How can I actually get more bang for my buck per repetition? And what people are not understanding is that exercise by far is one of the best ways to improve brain change and increase neuroplasticity. So we talked about BDNF, but another thing that exercise promotes is more blood flow to the brain. So that means more oxygen. You're able to have a more energetic brain so it can compute things better, and you're getting more nutrients to the brain. So it's like it's an all-in-one thing. You have your garden, which is your brain, right? The exercise is literally adding the miracle grow so that you can have the right seed sprout. And the seeds are going to be the inputs or the exercises that we program for the day or for the week, whatever. So you get BDNF, you get increased blood flow, you have increased neuroplasticity, you actually increase the amount of neurogenesis in the brain, in the hippocampus. So periodically throughout your day, your brain creates new neurons, but when you exercise, you actually boost the amount of new neurons that you create in the brain. So all in all, exercise is highly slept on as a mental health tool.
I think another takeaway, my approach, when I tell people with exercise, I always say it's a productive, not positive, but a productive simulation of the fight or flight response,
It
right?
is.
So you increase your heart rate when you're in stress response, you increase your respiratory rate, your blood vessels constrict, you start sweating. So all these symptoms happen in the stress response, fight or flight, but they're associated with negative outcomes. But with exercise, even if you're not a big fan of exercise, which some people aren't because they're like, oh, I got to go exercise, but they understand that it's good for them. So that's why I use the term productive, because their perception might be like, it's a chore, but they still know it's good for them. So the difference is the anxiety, or almost like low key, almost like a panic attack to a certain degree. You're simulating, but you're doing it for something good, like getting better muscle strength or getting better respiratory rate or more cardio endurance. And that's, I think, the big takeaway people don't think about is you're getting more acclimated to this, but with better outcomes versus worrying and panicking, which is unproductive outcomes.
Right. So when you have stress in a small amount, like just enough, not too overwhelming, not too chronic, it actually has an adaptive effect on the body. And I like to think of it as increasing resilience to stress because, like you said, you're simulating the stress response every time you exercise. But if you're not used to exercise, you can interpret those signs as a panic attack or as
Mhm.
anxiety, right? And so teaching people how to regulate their heart rate, how to understand the signals of their physiology as they're exercising, and understanding that, wait a minute, these are the same things that happen when I'm stressed, but everything's okay. I'm like actually doing something that is going to help me. You start reframing your perception or your concept of stress. And that is actually one of the, I believe, one of the biggest reasons why exercise is such a powerful regulator of stress and maybe even anxiety too.
So on this other side of it, so obviously exercise is a big part of NeuroGym, and you're big on prescribing different workout programs to help with that. But on the more cognitive performance, the brain training, the
Mm.
stuff that requires some kind of working memory or impulse control, things like that. Let's talk about that because there's a big school of thought, or not even school of thought. There's a group of people on this umbrella we call mental and brain health, right? There's so many things that can go under this. It's too many. Sometimes it causes infighting, but I've colleagues who I know very well that look at it as nonsense or not very beneficial. So what would your take be on that to say that is it pointless? I know you don't agree with that, but what do you think that comes from? Because there's a lot of people who say doing the brain training, whether it's like a cognitive app or things of that nature, is not as much as it really is.
Yeah, I definitely came from that side. I will admit, I used to see, they call them neurobics in the past, like these hand exercises where you're kind of like sticking up two fingers on your right hand and three fingers on your left hand, and then you're switching them, and you're like, oh wow, this might be a little challenging, but you're just thinking like, what's the point? Like, okay, it's a little bit challenging, but what am I getting out of this? And as I started diving deeper into the brain training, I realized, one, we think about chiseling our body and sculpting our body physically, and we can see those transformations, but the brain is very similar. We have to understand that, like, we can only flex and we can only move and contract our muscles because we have a brain. And so, in a way, they're very tightly linked, and they actually both operate on this process called use it or lose it. Um, so if you don't use cognitive functions like working memory, focus, sustained attention, emotional regulation, impulse control, you can actually see an atrophy of these mental muscles over time. Um, and if you were to just do a one session with some of the cognitive training that Nicholas does with Mind Body One or at the NeuroGym, you would feel a difference that same session.
Mhm.
I personally, when I incorporate working memory drills, impulse control drills, sustained attention, and goal oriented motivation drills into my workouts, I feel cognitively sharper. I feel like I can regulate my emotions better. I feel like I can think clearer. I can react faster. I'm less prone to stress, all from a single training session because, like I said, you're combining exercise with the cognitive training. So on the outside, it looks gimmicky, but you have to understand that we're trying to chisel these cognitive muscles the same way we chisel our body. And you have to stick with it for a period of time to see results. It's not, um, I mean, like I said, you'll see it with the first session, and because it's the brain, it actually changes faster than the physical
Mhm.
body. But if you want to see, consistent, sustained change, it's going to take some time. Um, I want to say one more thing about this because I think it's important. Um, Basically, it's not a gimmick because you use the same circuits for these mental muscles. So, like when we talk about sustained focus or emotional regulation or impulse control or working memory, the same brain regions are always involved, whether you're doing it in the gym session or you're doing it in the real world. It You might think that it doesn't translate, but the same muscles are used in all contexts. So
Mhm.
if you can train it in a safe environment, you can translate that to unpredictable dynamic environments outside of the gym.
It's like when they say it's like an analogy. I'm gonna mess it up, but they say the same fire that would like melt ice makes a hard boiled egg hard. So it's like it's the same implementation, but the outcomes are different because of the stimuli. So it's the same thing. And when you mentioned executive functions like working memory and all of that, emotional regulation, I use this a lot when I talk with sport coaches. Every sports skill, like let's use football, American football, for example. When a quarterback drops back to take a pass, snaps the ball, they're using working memory because now they got to take in what's happening with the defense coming at them, but then have to call from long-term memory, recall what was the actual play, what route is the receiver running, what is the blocking assignment. So now you got working memory, long-term memory. Then you have reaction time. Oh shoot, he's about to tackle me. Move out the way.
Right.
So when they talk about, oh, that's just awareness or he's got the gift, they're really talking about mental and cognitive skills. That's really what they're talking
That's
about.
true.
It's just we don't word it that way, and it goes back to the understanding of going that word gimmicky. It's not that it's gimmicky, it's just that you don't know how to explain it. Therefore, you can throw it away and say, oh, that's gimmicky, because everything you explain with working memory, self-regulation, how your brain adapts quicker than muscles, which is true, is literally what we do I use football because I think a lot of people at home will understand that easier than other examples, but that's literally all it is. It's just that we don't give it that name, but that's what mental training and brain health is all about. Training these skills because you're using them whether you're driving, like you said, and a same brain that's going to get you out of a car accident when you react last second on your peripheral vision, the same brain that allows you to catch a touchdown
Exactly.
or pass a SAT. It's the
Exactly.
same brain, just we got to understand. But people get that though. And I want to go into a little of a tangent because I had a friend, as you mentioned ADHD in the last episode, he thought mental, especially like ADHD specifically, was fake. And my counter was, okay, maybe it may be overdiagnosed these days, but it does exist because there's reasons to brain that are more overactive. So I said to refute his theory, and I think this made him get it. And since then, we've never had this convo again. That was like 4 years ago. I said to him, you understand drug addiction, right? You understand drugs, period. He's like, of course. So have you ever gotten high? He's like, yeah. So what did happen to your brain? It was weed. So he's like, well, I got a little, calmer, mellow. I was kind of like laughing. I started forgetting things. So I was like, oh, so you see how that alters your brain? Now imagine a premise where that happens to someone's brain similarly, but it didn't require drugs.
Mhm.
That's what some mental disorders look like. Maybe not the symptoms of like smoking marijuana,
But it's a chronic change in the person's brain functioning.
yeah, and it doesn't require the drug. So he could understand that now because he's like, okay, it does alter my brain, but he only thinks it from the drug usage. But from a person who has some kind of disorder, maybe not even a subclinical, it doesn't have to be disorder. It's depression, even if it's a smaller bout, not major depressive, it's affecting your brain. It's changing how your brain operates. And I think after that, he really got it. And I think more people need to look at it like that, that they understand that our brain can be altered. I don't think any person on earth denies that. But when it comes to improving it, that's where I think the criticism comes from for some reason.
Yeah, that you hit the nail on the head, especially with mental health disorders. One, people think that they're purely genetic. So like, okay, because my mom suffered from general anxiety disorder, that does put me at a higher risk for developing the same thing, but it's a risk. It's it's not fate. Um, and the same way that people can develop mental health disorders, the direction of change is not just unilateral or unidirectional. It goes both ways. And somehow as a society, we've conditioned everyone to think that, okay, I've been diagnosed with this mental health disorder. All I can do now is manage it, not reduce the symptoms, not be more neurotypical, whatever that means. It's just like, this is it. This is my brain, and I just have to accept that. And when we talk a lot about neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity isn't unique to neurotypical brains. Neuroplasticity is involved in every brain. Now, these mechanisms might be slightly impaired or maybe severely impaired based on the mental health disorder, but things can be done to reverse this. Um, it's a big reason why exercise is actually a very great mental health treatment, because it increases the plasticity of the brain and helps people create an opportunity to change their mental health reality. And that's a message that I want everyone to take home is, your brain is not fixed at any point in time. Like, your brain today is going to change throughout the 24 hours of the day. Your morning brain is not your evening brain, and vice versa, or like in the afternoon. Your brain today is different than your brain tomorrow. Your brain tomorrow is different from the brain a year from now, and it's a constant, continuous adaptive process that is going on at all times. So you can choose at any point in time to say, you know what, I'm tired of how my brain works this way. I want to make a difference. Like, I want to change it. For some people, they look to pills for that. Now, not everyone responds favorably to them. Some people try therapy. But with the NeuroGym, I'm trying to get people to understand, like, there's other ways too.
Mhm.
Like, especially with you have experience in neurofeedback. That's another way that people can help treat their mental health disorder. But the point is we've got to see it as a solvable problem before we can actually make really big dents in the mental health crisis.
So I think that's a perfect transition to part 3, because we talked about neuroplasticity, and I'll end it with this caveat is, just like you said, it changes the brain, but people don't think about the positive side. I think it's become a buzzword in psychology and neuroscience that neuroplasticity, make your brain change in a positive way, but they forget that it can adapt the other way too.
Right. There's adaptive and maladaptive neuroplasticity.
And going back to my career in drug addiction, that's literally what they were doing. Their brain was adapting. It just was going
the wrong way.
Remember the J. Cole line?
Yeah.
The good news is, man, you came a long way, but the bad news is you went the wrong way. So it can go both. And I think not us, but people in general forget that you can adapt maladaptively and go the opposite direction. So with that being said, we're going to go into part 3, the final part of this series, about the industry, because all this builds up to say, we know how you got here. We know how me and you might practice this stuff, but why isn't this as big as it should be? We know that from a buzz pop psychology standpoint, it's getting a lot more light, yes, but probably not in a way, because you got things like the whole mindfulness movement. Obviously, yoga gets thrown in there. These are not the things we're doing per se. It's nothing against those. I'm fine with that, meditation, yoga, but we're being, as I call it, dynamic mental health. There's passive and static mental health, just like there's passive and static stretching, but there's also dynamic stretching. There's workouts, and all of that, and from the mental side, goes together. So this next episode, we're going to talk about how the industry can get to where we think it should be. So stay tuned.